of like social dynamite that could rebel at any moment and overthrow things. It pose a real threat to what's going on. Well, the punishment apparatus could be used as a way to deal with that. Punishment can be used to fulfill economic needs. It's not surprising that we had penal colonies in the West for a long time. We needed to send people to work on the colony, like do the manual labor that free men didn't want to do. It's like galley slavery was a punishment for a long time before the invention of the sale. Because there was an economic need that punishment for that punishment is bigger than just crime. Punishment is bigger than just crime. It does things beyond just respond to crime. Because of that, we want to know why some people and places, states, etc., schools perhaps too, are more punitive than others. Why is it that some people and some places are more punitive than other places? They have more money. That's the thing that maybe we can explain. It's a new variable. It's a new way of thinking. It's not just crime. We can think about punishment as its own social phenomenon. How do we explain variation in the amount of punishment, the type of punishment that's being imposed, or that's desired by certain variation in the severity of punishment? How do we explain individual variation in punitiveness and punitive sentence? There's all different theories of this. I taught a class this past fall, the honor, about like punishment in society. We're digging into this. It takes a whole class because it's intense. This is just a little bit of it. This is just a little taste of what it means to think about punishment in this way. There's merely one theory of punitive, which is the phenomenon of social threat and the social threat hypothesis and perspective. So here's, again, one way of thinking about punishment that we can theorize about and then test here. The social threat perspective comes, which is what we're talking about, comes from and is closely related to conflict. Talked a little bit about conflict theory some weeks back. Conflict theory is based on the notion that society is characterized by conflict. All different types of social groups are in conflict with each other. And we can't understand the world as based on consensus. We have to understand it as based on conflict. This emerged out of the context of the 1960s, so there were conflicts everywhere, so maybe not surprising. So the social threat perspective argues from this conflict lens that punishment and punitiveness vary by community context. The unit of analysis is less the individual and more the place. The place is the unit of analysis. This could be a city, this could be a county, this could be a state, this could be a country. But it's a theory of differences in punishment and punitiveness across places, across areas. The characteristics of these areas might make some of those areas more punitive than others. They arrest more people. They have higher incarceration rates. The people who live there are more likely to support harsher, more punitive type responses to crime. So the social threat framework is a way of theorizing about why punitiveness varies across geographic spaces, why some places are more punitive than other places. There's this intergroup competition that drives the social threat framework. This notion of intergroup competition. Society is understood as dominated by competition between groups for things, specifically resources. You have groups that are competing. This is like what kind of drives all of like human progress. It's like competition between groups, right? That's a really big idea that we're not going to get. But that's the break. That's the other thing. Is that it's not that we all share the same sort of understanding. We're also like coming together and holding hands all the time. People. That's not what this is about. Instead, this is about groups, people competing for finite reasons. It's often the case in this intergroup competition context that one group can emerge as more dominant and having access to more resources than other groups. Okay. One group emerges as more empowered. One group can emerge as more dominant than other groups. Individual members of these groups, their perspectives, Their understandings and experiences with the world are tied to the position of the group they're in. So what's good for the group is good for you, what's good for you is good for the relationship there. So you and your own individual position is tied to the groups in which you are connected. So the identities, values, and priorities of the individual are tied to the groups in which you're in, sort of in this big understanding of the world as comprised of or consisting of conflict between different types of groups. Now, what do we mean by different types of groups? They can be ethnic groups, they can be racial groups, they can be religious groups, they can be political groups, they can be economic groups. There's all different kinds of groups that fits into this perspective. There's all different kinds of ways of understanding social categories and how they relate to each other. The theory has massive application in that sense because there's all different types of groups that we can divide people into. So society is characterized by groups. And competition between those groups is basically an underlying characteristic of the human experience. That's the argument. The argument also goes that individual members of these groups and their values, priorities, and identities, experiences are very much tied to the position of the group. So how does punishment and punitiveness fit into this? Because society is characterized by group conflict, social institutions of all different kinds, but those institutions especially that produce control, institutions of social control, those institutions become tools. They become ways of getting advantage. They become ways of making sure that your group is better off than other groups. Again, in this sort of competition for especially political and economic reasons. So the idea is that because we have groups that differ in the amount of resources that the dominant group can use six resources to prevent less dominant groups from growing and achieving things like political status, economic viability, etc. So this is how, according to the social threat framework, you can understand punitiveness in certain part. We can understand punitiveness at least in part as a kind of tool, as a way of achieving group advantage. The ability of the justice system to identify and then control certain numbers of population renders it a mechanism of social control. We can reward certain behaviors and punish others, but we can use it as a way of coercing. We can use it as a resource, as a tool to achieve advantage in these sort of like bigger political and economic contests and competition. A related, even bigger idea, and one that we almost hinted at here and there in this court, is like laws don't just come out of nowhere. But where do they come from? They come from all of us contributing to our shared understanding of what we hold sacred, and then we criminalize things that we that are contrary to our shared value. Or is it that some people's values and perspectives have more sway? Some people's values, opinions, and perspectives on the world come to be seen in law, and others don't. We don't all agree. So whose values are represented in law when there is disagreement? So those, the argument goes, with political capital are able to leverage and use that political behaviors, criminalized behaviors that are maybe even behaviors of threatening group. Then you have a legal mechanism of control. You have a legal mechanism by which you can control and leverage power, in a sense. You can leverage power in a way that benefits the rich all. So as a result, the justice system is not just a technical response, not just a technical response. It's a tool. It's a way of achieving advantage, political and economic advantage. So all of this forms kind of the bedrock of the social threat perspective. It understands justice system resources and the application of police and courts as tools of control that can be used not in response to crime, but also to other things. We can leverage this as a means of control, as a tool of control. So that's the framework. So what happens when you have the less dominant group who sort of emerge and show power, show demonstrations of power in some way? Well, social control is expected then to be amplified, to increase, to deal with this emerging threat. That's why it's called social. These are things that represent types of threats and things, contexts between groups. So what are these types of threats? What does a, say, growing minority population mean? It can mean a few things. One, it can mean political. A political threat is a kind of threat that is related to the ability of a minority group to demonstrate political viability, like voting power, where you have more members of the less dominant group demonstrating in one form or another greater political power in a variety of ways. You can also have what's called economic threat. Economic threat relates to the ability of a minority group to basically compete economically, to leverage the characteristics of the population, including the growth of the population itself, to basically achieve advantages in the location, compete economically by filling vacant jobs. A third type of threat that can emerge is what's called a status threat. And a status threat is one where you have members of the less dominant group, or as a group generally, sort of demonstrating some kind of cultural visibility. And any or one of these things can happen simultaneously. You can have an increase in political threat that's sort of like mixed with economic threat, maybe there's status threat involved as well. They can all happen simultaneously to greater or less. Okay. All of them ultimately, so we heard it goes, eventuate in the same outcome. They eventuate in the same outcome, which is a perception among the dominant group of the minority group as threatening and something needs to be done about it. So here's the stepwise process, according to the social threat framework, that these types of threats relate to, especially punishment, against the justice system. So you have these shows of power, these shows of threat, political, economic, and status. By the way, a lot of this comes from we haven't mentioned any names. But there were a few key names. This theory, this perspective, emerged most dramatic in the late 1960s by a guy named Hubert Blaylock. And the book that articulated this theory is called Toward a Theory of Minority Group Relation, 1967, Toward a Theory of Minority Group Relation, Hubert Blaylock. The book is really hard to find. So if you find it, hold on to it because it's likely valuable. They haven't reprinted it in a very, very long time. It's unfortunate because the perspective is one of this theory. That's why we're talking about it. In the past 20 years, one of the most tested theories in criminology, which is very true. Like what are you talking about? But it is a dominant theory in the field. It's not like a niche theory. This is like a dominant theory. Okay. So, for the theory of minority group relations by Hubert Blaylock, 1967. Here's how the process unfolds. When you have political economic or status that is burdening among the less dominant. Here's what happens. You have members of the dominant group that are exposed to members of the minority group. This produces a feeling of animus and resentment among members of the majority. Maybe you don't, for example, want to have them in stages. That's an example, a measure of animus, of resentment for members of the minority. Those who have the capacity will execute discriminatory action. This can include police, This can include prosecutors, this can include